Now that we're all caught up on the progress of the railroad, we'll look at some of the control components that I added to the main line that allow both local control or complete takeover by a dispatcher located elsewhere. While the vast majority of the yard is operated on the spot by hand, I felt that anything attached to the main line should at least have the option of being controlled from a central location. Not really knowing what style of operations best suited this part of Denver in the late 1960s to mid-70s, I figured that a system that was capable of CTC level control could be adopted quite easily to something else should my knowledge of Denver rail operations improve. At the very least, all of the required machinery and circuits would be in place. To that end, I set out to install and wire some tortoise machines to the 3 turnouts that are actually tied to the main trackage. It's worth noting that 2 of these switches actually form a kind of misaligned crossover, so I knew that no matter what, these 2 machines would be wired together, since throwing one switch would require throwing the other. That left the remaining switch under Larimer Street, which I had originally tried to interlock with the crossover. My thinking was that when the crossover was aligned through the area, it then followed that the 3rd switch should also be aligned for that route by default. Eventually, I used the various contacts on the tortoise machines to create a one-toggle setup from which I threw all 3 to the correct position with one flick, and then allowed local control of the 3rd switch when the crossover was returned to its normal position. However, the desire for dual control panels, one on each side of the module, would eventually lead to the addition of a Digitrax DS64, and soon a new idea had formed. I figured that if there was some kind of central dispatch, even if only in model railroading form, the kind of interlocking protection I was trying to come up with would most likely reside in that system. Also, knowing what kind of programming was possible with the Digitrax controls, I knew a sort of AirSats interlocking could be built into the thing if that became necessary. However, I wanted this to be fun and cool, because that's what we do in model railroading, right? And I had an idea for making control panels that would really pop. I had mentioned before with my associated railroads about making temporary control panels using gang boxes and Lexan. Well, one thing I discovered during all of that was that the solid color painted on the back of the panel was actually translucent enough to be backlighted, and that if I planned carefully, one could make LED backlit control panels that would look good and read well in the dark should you choose to be into nighttime operations. To that end, I went on Amazon and found a 10-pack of 4x6-inch plastic placards, which are typically used by wedding and event planners for making nameplates or small signs. They're essentially 1/8-inch plexiglass tags with nice rounded corners and enough surface area to make a competent control panel, even with large switches. As it would turn out, large switches were just what I used. One of the problems I had to overcome in making a dual panel setup was how to change the state of something without having to chase it down from the other side. Alrighty, so here we see standard tortoise machine switch wiring. We got a simple double pull double throw switch that's been cross wired to flip the polarity to the machine, and then your standard control panel with like a bat handle toggle switch on there, so if the route's flipped up it switches to that route, if it's down it switches to that route. Alright. So, what if you want to add a second control panel? Well, one of the things that can happen here is that when you have a switch flipped up on one side, you can have it flipped down on the other side. And part of the reason for this is because of the way you have to wire a second double pull double throw switch in order to flip the polarity to the first switch that's actually wired to your turnout machine. And having these different bat handle positions on your control panels can create confusion for other operators. But basically, as you can see, the power from one switch flips the power going into the other switch, which flips the power into the tortoise machine. Now you can overcome all this by losing the second switch, and instead of using a switch, use a double pull double throw relay with the same cross wiring on it, and the power simply comes in there. We don't have to worry about that, because our control is going to be of the relay itself, which can be done with momentary contact push buttons, meaning you can say push the red one for that route, push the green one for that route, and then if you wanted to add a second control panel, then you could basically just duplicate that same wiring, wire them in parallel to the relay, so that no matter which way panel you were on, it would flip the switch. Now, I wondered, what if we lost the 2-button setup, and instead came up with a way to do one button. How exactly would we do that? With that in mind, I found some nice flush mount push buttons that also featured a halo LED light that could be wired independently, which would be perfect for what followed. One of the features of the DS64 decoder is the ability to use single button external controls to throw a switch, where each push of the button actually changes the state of the switch without regard for its position. As such, the momentary nature of the buttons fed well into dual panels, and I only needed half as many buttons on each panel. As a bonus, such a system can be installed whether there's DCC or not, since this function of the DS64 is self-contained in the hardware. Now, I just had to deal with the need for dispatcher control. This would come courtesy of the Digitrax DS52, which allows two switch machines to be controlled via DCC using the track bus. In my case, I used it to run a pair of Atlas snap relays so that the local control components could be isolated from the LocoNet control, allowing the dispatcher to lock out local operators and line a safe route through the area. Because the snap relay is essentially a double pole, double throw, bistable latching relay, I could use one side of the switch to cut off the push buttons, and the other side would control indicators on the panel showing whether the push buttons had power or not. This function came courtesy of that halo ring around each button, hence why I wanted them to be separately wired. Once this was established, all that was left was to install position lights on the panel to indicate which route had been set. I used some 2mm cool white LEDs for this, which had initially been purchased to use as locomotive headlights until I saw the color. They were plenty bright enough even when powered by the 5-volt rail of my power supply, however, and they have their own built-in resistors for easy wiring, and I could keep them in place with a little bit of Elmer's white glue. I may have to come up with some means of illustrating the wiring for all of this, but suffice to say it all works as planned. The DS64 controls the turnout motors, the motors throw the switches and switch panel indicator lights, the buttons give me manual control, and the DS52 and relays control those buttons. Once it was all tested, I made recesses in the fascia to mount the panels, focusing on the first section since the only part of the system that wasn't attached to it was the other turnout motor for the crossover. This was bridged with 2 wires and some Anderson plugs. Everything else fits under the module and stays behind the outer surface of the fascia so as to reduce any risk of damage during transport. Okay, remember I had mentioned before about backlighting the panel? Well, I experimented with that, and using LED strip lights, they can run on 12 volt or 5 volt depending on which ones you get. These seemed to work okay, but they were very cumbersome to mount, and with the white LEDs indicating the track position and the blue halo rings around the push button switches, I kind of felt like I already had enough lighting on these things as it is. So I don't know if it's necessarily worth the trouble. I might cover that at some point if I can find an easier way to mount the lighting, but until then, it seems like painting legs onto a snake. So that's one little piggy. The other thing was whether or not to integrate shutting off track power as part of the interlocking system from the dispatcher. And I decided against that because no matter what the system is, the dispatcher is going to have to communicate with those operators in some way, shape, or form. So whether or not they're occupying the main line will be a matter of that communication system, not so much automatically stopping a train whether it knows it's going to stop or not. That seems like more of a model railroad thing, not so much a prototype thing. So it may require a bit more prototypical operating practice in terms of how to run the trains and how to dispatch them. Now, it may be possible later to cut that kind of wiring into there, but I think in order to make that happen would require a lot more in terms of a larger pre-planned setup, the way you would have on your model railroad at home. So I'm not so sure about integrating rail power control into that. I think it'll be enough to get a competent switch and signal system going and count on the engineers to obey their signals and not pass the adios amigo point. So anyway, that's about where the railroad sits right now. I won't say I had a lot of fun doing the wiring because with most wiring situations, it's a lot of work that most people don't really see. You only see the results of it when the trains actually run and you're able to throw a switch from your iPhone in the other room. So that's the update for now. Thanks for coming out.